All right, it is 6 o'clock on the dot, so I'd like to go ahead and get started with this evening's meeting. My name is Rakia Nance, and on behalf of the Anne Arundel County Department of Public Works, I'd like to welcome you to tonight's meeting. We are here to discuss the Septic to Sewer Connection Program as it relates to both the Glen Oban and Severn View communities. I'd like to note that tonight's meeting is being recorded, and later on in the presentation, we'll explain how you can access both the meeting recording and the slides. Here are a few of the people that you'll be hearing from during tonight's call. From the Department of Public Works, we have George Heiner, also Ron Briggerman, and Lynn Berry. From HDR, in addition to myself, we have Ed Shea, and also Megan Robinson. Here's a bit of background about the purpose of tonight's meeting. We've received some interest from residents in both communities over the past several months. And so this meeting is designed to help you learn more information about the changes to the existing petition process and also the community-driven process to connect to public sewer. We are not asking you to make any sort of decision tonight. We are just seeking input and interest in sharing information. We're also not advocating for this program one way or the other. Ultimately, it's a community decision whether to connect to public sewer. And again, we'll detail those steps in the process as we progress in the meeting. Here's an overview of the information we'll be discussing tonight. And I would like to note that you can enter your questions in the chat box, or if you prefer, you can unmute yourself and you can ask your questions verbally. First, we'll be discussing the wastewater service extension process and the benefits, followed by funding and costs. Then we'll discuss the application and petition process, followed by next steps and Q&A. And with that, I will turn things over to George Heiner with the Department of Public Works. George?
Okay, thank you, Rakia, and good evening, everyone. Okay, got my camera on now. So I'm going to talk a little bit in a couple of spots tonight about the petition process and the Septic to Sewer Connection Program. As Rakia mentioned, she's with HDR, which is an engineering consulting firm that's helped us with the technical and the communications aspects of the program. And we also will be talking about the costs a little bit with our utility assessments folks. So we wanted to start with just a discussion of what is the petition process. So Rakia mentioned it's a community-driven process, and what the petition process is essentially the residents are requesting that the Department of Public Works extend public service to their area. And in the code, it's actually referred to as an extension on initiation by the property owners. And there's actually there's a process. This can be done for water service or for sewer service. And what's different that we're going to be talking about tonight is some of the financial assistance that's available for the sewer side of it. So that's one aspect. The service extension request is really the key component of the petition, and it comes from the residents within an area. So we'll also talk a little bit tonight about a community coordinator, and this is really a person that can be the go-between with Public Works and the broader community, and help us define the area and help measure interest in the community. And we'll talk a little bit near the end about the application part of the program, which is an application to be considered for a subsidy, and we'll talk more about that later. It's a step that occurs before the petition process. It's a pre-petition step, and the community application is not a binding vote or a commitment. It's really just an expression of interest. So I mentioned there the water service extension follows a similar process to sewer extensions, but the subsidy and assessment deferments that we're going to talk more about later today are only available for the sewer projects and not water projects. Can you go to the next slide? So, as I mentioned, there's existing code there's for a long time for extension of water and sewer systems. So why would residents be interested in a sewer system extension? So we're going to talk just for a few minutes about what some of those benefits might be for a homeowner. The one is that in some cases, your building addition or the size of your building is tied to the size of your septic system and your drain field. So there can be restrictions on how you can build on the property based on your septic system. Another thing that can occur is if sometimes there's limitations on the use of your yard in the back. It needs to be there needs to be an active drain field, but there's usually a spare drain field for future drain field. There can also be a positive impact on your home value, although that can be very site specific. If that's something that's motivating for you, we would suggest trying to talk to a realtor about that type of question. Can you go to the next slide? So some other benefits on the homeowner side would be there can be improvements to your nearby waterways. What's really happening when you're decommissioning your septic system and you're going into the public system is going to carry that wastewater out and take it to one of our centralized treatment facilities. And so there will no longer be a septic drain field leachate that goes through the groundwater and eventually migrates to the receiving water. So that will make a difference in what goes into the receiving waters. And there are also some costs that are avoided associated with septic systems. So if I go to the next slide, septic systems are relatively low cost, but there are some costs associated with them. The most typical cost is as a septic pump out, which can occur every 2 to 3 years, and it's generally around $100. It's probably a little more now with the cost of fuel. The more expensive component for septic systems is usually the replacement of a drain field. So if the soils are more or less exhausted in your drain field and they're not able to treat the wastewater, you'd need to have that drain field replaced or a new one constructed. That tends to be the most costly. There's also a traditional septic system is really a tank that has some chambers to separate the solids from the liquids. There's another type of septic system that we're calling a BAT. That's the best available technology. That's a nitrogen removing septic system, and it has more mechanical components. It usually has an aerator and a mixer, and so the O&M costs for that are higher per year, and the drain field replacement cost is about the same. So if you go to the next slide. So as Rakia mentioned, we had some interest from the two different areas, so that's why we're talking tonight about both areas. And there's really two separate drainage areas. This is a conceptual, kind of very high level map that we developed several years ago. And in this particular area, the Glen area would pump into the Severn View area, and then there would be another pumping station in that area that would go further north and eventually connect in close to Route 2 and kind of make its way over to the community college. So one thing we probably ought to note is that I think we showed this probably based on the HOA boundaries, but a property, an area for a potential project doesn't have to conform to an HOA boundary. There are some constraints on a project area. It has to be continuous from the point of connection to the county system all the way back to the end. So it would be really, this would be the end, Glen would be the end, and then kind of moving out of that area, it would go, back towards the county's system. So in total, we were counting up 59 properties in the Glen Oban, 92 in Severn View, and so around 160, 150 something combined. And with that, I think I just want to pause for questions. Does anyone have any basic questions on the petition process in general? Okay. So I'm going to hand it off next to, I think, Ed Shea. Ed, you're with us tonight, right? Yep.
Yes, good evening.
Okay. And Ed is with HDR, and he's going to talk through the costs and how some of these projects are funded. Go ahead, Ed.
Okay, hello. So this next slide illustrates the three major components of the cost to connect to public sewer. There's three basic elements that are shown here. So there's the project cost to construct local sewers in the right-of-way. That's shown on the side that says public in that graphic. Then there's the on-site costs, or what we call the private side costs. And that would be abandoning your septic tank and installing a new pipe to direct the sewage flow out to the main sewer. And then the third element is the capital facility connection charge, which is represents the county's investment in the wastewater reclamation facility capacity to treat your wastewater. So what does this cost in, big picture, high level costs for these three elements? The public project cost, so the public sewer in the street, the typical annual costs for the homeowner would range from about $1,500 to $2,600. This, we're going to go through some detail about the different options for payment and financing that may influence that range. This also includes typical sewer usage fees that are billed quarterly. So we're talking about annual costs, and we'll go into further detail as we go along on how that's made up. But roughly, homes in your community, based on the preliminary sewer system layouts that we've evaluated, would put you in a range of $1,500 to $2,600 per year for a period of 40 years. The upfront costs would be made up of the private side costs to abandon your septic system, as well as the capital facility connection charge. The private on-site costs are typically going to be less than $10,000, and we'll show you some historical cost information we have. There's a lot of factors that go into that, but most of the time, a very high percentage of homes are going to be less than $10,000. The CFCC is a set number that gets increased. Typically every year it goes up by a little bit. So that charge is fixed, and currently it's $10,286. And the cost models that DPW is using assume that $15,000 of the Bay Restoration Fund grant will be used to pay for most or all of these costs. So adding 10,000 and 10,286, you could see that would be over 15,000. But for most homes, 15,000 is going to cover most, if not all, of those upfront costs. So we'll look at those in a little bit more detail in the next few slides. The potential funding sources are coming from the county and the state to help support the costs that the homeowner experiences. So from the county's side, there's a county subsidy set up by recent legislation. This is a new program. The subsidy was not previously available before this year. And that allows up to 25% of the project costs, the public side costs to build the sewer in the right of way, to be covered by the subsidy. The state has the Bay Restoration Fund grant, and homeowners pay into that fund currently, and then that money is available to offset on-site costs. So this is the Bay Restoration Fund grants have been available for a number of years. Most of the connections that DPW or the Department of Health may facilitate through that fund are single connections, as opposed to a petition project, which is what we're talking about tonight. But we do have a history of what those costs are, and that's what the BRF fund is traditionally used for. And then the remaining costs are passed to the homeowner through the annual assessment. So a little bit more about the capital facility connection charge. As I mentioned, this is a one-time charge upfront. The value is set each year. It's defined in the county code to recover the cost to construct infrastructure. And DPW offers the option for the homeowner to pay this cost upfront or to finance the cost over 40 years. And the charge for your CFCC would be determined when the construction project begins. So currently it's $10,286. If the construction project for the sewer system were to happen in 2 years, whatever the charge is at that time, that would be used. And then a little bit more on the private side costs. So like we said when we were looking at that image, it's the septic tank abandonment, piping from your home. So you're basically redirecting the flow that would normally go to your septic system to go connect to the sewer main in the street. And then any property restoration costs that are attributed to that. Typically, that's just going to be, filling in the trench and planting grass. But some properties may have landscaping, structures on site. If you have a small retaining wall, that can drive up the cost. But for most homes, the cost will be less than $10,000. Just a shot here on the next slide, historical costs that the Department of Health has tracked from their role administering the funds for the grant program. You can see the frequency here on the left. 25% of these are, total 50% are ranging from $2,000 to $6,000 for on-site costs. And most of these are below $10,000. So yes, sometimes for sites where it could be a longer distance from the home to the public right of way, larger property sizes, depending on the topography, some homes could have a higher cost that would put them on the right end of the scale. And then just wrapping up this look at costs, a little bit more detail on the public side project costs. So this is the local sewer system in the street. It's paid for in the form of an annual assessment. So this is separate from your tax bill. This is a separate annual assessment at the beginning of each year, and it's paid back over 40 years. This is a new feature of the program that's been set up recently. The 40-year payback was not available before. And the county and state may provide financial assistance and payment deferments for eligible households. So we're going to go into a few examples and some of the details on the deferments. But that's really what can make it a little bit more affordable on the annual basis, closer to that $1,500 end of the range. And we can take a few questions now, and then when we come back, we'll delve into that a little bit further as far as the deferment options and how that affects the annual assessment. It looks like we have a few questions in the chat.
Yeah, I see. The first question is, what determines interest rate on the 40-year payback loan?
So the county gets low interest loans through the state's revolving fund program. And I don't have the current interest rate, but typically, I guess a year ago we were saying it's about 1%. It's probably a little bit higher now for a 40-year payback. I think the county actually borrows it on a 30-year term. But these are reduced rates based on that state revolving fund loan program.
All right. The next question is, with the existing sewer that is set up in Severn View and Glen, is that what we would connect to, or does a whole new one need to be built?
So there is not an existing sewer system in Glen and Severn View. The nearest system that DPW is proposing to connect to, as George described, it's a little bit north of the community college. And so there's a significant distance to convey sewage from, I guess, the northern side of the Severn View neighborhood up to the existing sewer system. I forget the exact footage. I want to say it's like about a mile north of the neighborhood.
The existing lines around your house that would take sewage from house into your septic system, so those would need to be rerouted in the immediate area around your house.
Yeah, and then just following up on the graphic that we showed on slide 9, Rakia, those are just showing parcel boundaries and streets. They don't show the existing. There is no existing sewer system. So the red lines in this graphic is just a boundary of DPW's preliminary management area. So each neighborhood has its own management area that would be connected with a new sewer system, but there's no existing sewer infrastructure.
I just had another question pop up. Why not run the sewer system all the way down B into A, encompassing all neighborhoods?
Well, the sewers are extended right now and water systems are actually either through development or through the petition process. So we wouldn't run a line all the way down, say that B and A area, unless we had a petition project that was going to be the appropriate way to serve that area.
Yeah, just add a further detail to that response. I think what we might be talking about there would be a sewer that runs south along the Baltimore-Annapolis Parkway that, would pick up a number of communities. So the way that the present program is set up, we would effectively have to see interest from many of the communities served to where it would make sense to take on that as one big project. Once this proposed sewer from Severn View connects north, actually a lot of the neighborhoods north of here are connected to sewer already. So this is actually a more realistic bite out of the apple, so to say, in terms of getting support from a couple communities that are in some proximity to that existing system.
All right, so it wouldn't make sense to reach out to all the communities along the route.
Yeah, so maybe Rakia, you could respond to that just by describing the outreach that has been set up and received to date.
Sure. So to date, our outreach includes the Our Water website. I'm sure some of you are familiar with that and what happens. If residents are interested in learning more about the program, they go on the website and leave a comment. And from there, we can map where those comments are coming from, and we can see clusters of interest. And so the reason that we're having this meeting tonight is because we saw clusters of interest from these two neighborhoods in particular. There was not any any interest or any comments submitted from any of the surrounding communities along this route.
So one thing that probably might help to explain a little bit in terms of the way the petition works. So the county DPW operates, or at least the water and sewer part operates as a utility enterprise fund. So all of our projects fund themselves, and so that's actually why when we extend, say, public sewer into an area, that the residents actually reimburse DPW for the cost of that project. So we really don't do projects where we're just sort of extending through an area when it's not related to a petition. Now, occasionally there's a separate capital project need, and we might run something, but those are usually our larger diameter, say, transmission mains where we're working on connecting different areas. So it is a reactive process. I think there's a question about it's a reactive process that is reflective of the way that the process is set up in the county code. So it is, I think we might have mentioned on the slide, it's actually called extension at the initiation of the property owners. So it's really is, we've made some modifications. I know it sounds very reactive, but it used to be more reactive than it is now. So but we aren't actively trying to extend it. We are reacting to a request by property owners.
All right. Have all 146 properties potentially in this request been apprised of the opportunity? We did send postcards, mailed invitations to all of the homeowners in the proposed potential project area to invite them to this meeting. Also, residents who had corresponded with us through the Our Water website, we sent them email reminders. In addition to that, we did contact the Glen HOA, and I'm aware that that correspondence was forwarded using their communication methods as well. And the next question, what do you consider a level of interest from a neighborhood? For these initial community meetings, we're generally looking for about 5% of initial interest to host an informational meeting.
And our real goal in these meetings is just to let people know about the changes to the program and to the process. And as Rikia mentioned, not necessarily really to advocate one way or the other. It's really we're presenting the information as best we can, and we know some specifics about what we think the costs might be based on some other studies that we've done. So we're sharing that information, but really it's something that the community needs to consider and then see if there's some broader interest.
All right. Next question. If there is a future project, would the connection fee not just be rolled up into the bill itself?
It can be, and we'll talk a little bit more about the financing part in the next section. But in most cases, it can be a lot of that can be covered by the Bay Restoration Fund grant from the state, and but it can also be financed.
Okay.
There's a question. Oh, go ahead.
I was just going to read this next question about what the timeline generally looks like.
So there's, go ahead.
I was just going to encourage us to keep moving because I think these next two questions are answered in the upcoming slides.
Okay.
Yeah.
So this is where we hand it off to Ron to provide a little bit more detail on how the annual assessment is developed and some of the options for deferment.
Good evening, folks. My name is Ron Briggerman. I work in the Department of Public Works and Financial Services. Our group deals with financing and deferment options related to these types of projects. When you look at the cost information involved in the projects, you have the construction cost, what it costs the county to construct the public sewer. Project costs include investigation, design, easements, and inspections, and also overhead. The net assessable amount, we do subtract if there is a portion of the project that goes to serve a future connection area, that would be taken away. The net assessable amount also considers the subsidy or state grant through low interest loans and so forth, the BRF grant, though in this case. And then also included in the assessable amount is the county incurred interest. So for us to work with bonds and so forth, and the interest that the county has to pay, that also has to be included in the net assessable amount. The net assessable amount is divided by the project total households, and then we have it repaid over a 40-year term. As Ed pointed out earlier, the 40-year term is new. It used to be 30 years. In the efforts of the county to try to make these more affordable. We do have the deferment options that Ed mentioned earlier that I would talk about, and also, the longer financing term, which hopefully makes it easier for folks to afford. You can go to the next slide, Rakia. Thank you. So deferral options, here's an overview of the options, and then we'll go through and break it down for you and give you an example of what we're talking about. But the first is a partial deferral option, and you can defer up to 50% of the assessment, the total per property assessment. This particular deferral option is available to all residential homeowners in a project area. You'll see when we go on to the next one that not all are eligible for the full deferment. But in this case, everybody would be able to take advantage of this. The total deferred portion becomes payable at the time of deed transfer or the sale of the home, or after 40 years, whichever occurs first. The non-deferred assessment continues after the property transfer. So we then look at the full deferral option. And with the full, it's a 100% deferral, and that's available to qualifying owners. And those qualifying owners are discussed in a little bit, but basically it's elderly, which is defined by code as 60 years and above, and also disabled folks. And they have to meet certain definitions in terms of their disability. The past deferred portion becomes payable at the time of the deed transfer, sale of the home, and the deferred assessment does not continue after the house is or the property is transferred. Excuse me, for vacant lots, there's no subsidy, there's no deferment option, and there's no Bay Restoration Fund grant program. And I don't recall the exact number, but I think there were like maybe 9 vacant lots in one community and 6 in the other, maybe. If you can go on to the next slide, Rakia. Okay, so looking at the partial deferral repayment, as I said, that's available to everyone in the project area, except the unimproved properties. And what we look at here is a 40-year total assessment, just to give you an example. If it were to be $80,000 per home or per property cost, the yearly assessment without deferral would be $2,000. 40 times 2,000 would be the 80,000. If you deferred 50%, then the deferred portion is $40,000. So what would happen is you're deferring 40, and then you're going to pay a yearly assessment of $1,000 per year instead of $2,000. The total due on transfer regardless of the transfer date, is $40,000. So when we get into another slide, you'll see exactly how that works. Continuing yearly assessment for the next homeowner is $1,000 a year. And that's because you would have been paying $1,000 each year. You would have paid $40,000 of the $80,000 when you sold the home or the property, and then they would have had $1,000 a year for the remaining portion of that 40 years. If you can go to the next slide. Thank you. The full deferral repayment. Now, this again is available to those who qualify as either elderly or disabled. And the deferral is 100%. So the 40-year assessment of $80,000, if you defer all 100% of it, that's $2,000 a year that you're not paying. So you're paying zero for the period that you're there. When you transfer the property, for every year deferred, you're paying $2,000 when the property sells. So, example, sell after 10 years, you would have to pay $20,000. You just put those $2,000 a year aside until you sell. So multiply the number of years you were there by the 2,000 and you get that 20. The continuing assessment for the next owner would be $2,000 a year. Okay, Rakia. So the deferment payback comparison, again, we're using that same example, 40 years, $80,000. The yearly assessment with no deferral is $2,000. If you use the 50% septic connection deferment, the partial, and you sold the house after year 5, you would pay $40,000 when you sold that property. You would have also have paid $1,000 for each of those 5 years. If you were looking at 10 years under the 50% connection deferment, you're paying $40,000. 15 years, you're paying $40,000. 20 years, you're paying $40,000. No matter what time period you sell, you stay in your home and you sell that property, you're paying $40,000, plus you would have paid $1,000 for each year that you were there. If you look at the 100% elderly or disabled deferment, at 5 years, you're deferring $2,000 a year, so you're at $10,000. 10 years, $20,000, 15, 30, and so forth. So the key thing to look at here is what you're going to pay back after how many years you're going to be in your home. We obviously don't give advice as to what you should do with deferment or anything, but that's something for you to consider what fits your needs the best. And if you can go on to the next slide, Rakia. So folks, do you have any questions about the deferment, ability to defer it, who qualifies, or anything like that? We'll certainly try to answer those for you.
So we had an earlier question about why we were considering the two communities together, and what would we do if one wanted to service and the other one didn't. So I can talk to that one a little bit. Is that because in the way we saw the two areas, that the Glen Oban area would pump into the Severn View area, and then the Severn View area would pump over towards the community college. And so that's why we saw them as linked that way. So basically one community would pump into the other one, and then that combined flow would go over. Now, from a technical feasibility standpoint, either location could go by itself, and how it would be probably more expensive on a per property basis, because there's usually an economy of scale for projects. So larger projects are generally less costly per household. There's a small difference in the way the infrastructure would be sized. So Ron had mentioned if there are some extra costs taken on to serve an area, that could be deducted. But those deductions are, in this situation, that would be relatively small, because we would so let's say you were pumping in Glen and Severn View did not want to connect. So we would build what's called a force main in Glen, which we were planning, which would happen anyway. But instead of tying into a pumping station at Severn View, it would just continue on through Severn View. Okay. So somewhere in that Severn View area, we would probably increase the size of that pipe a little bit just in case Severn View ever connected in the future. Okay. But the effect of that difference might be to maybe we switch to a 10-inch pipe instead of an 8-inch pipe. Okay. So that while there's a material cost difference, it's not a really large construction cost difference. If you picture like all the stuff that goes on when somebody's putting in a sewer line, you've got the construction crews, the equipment, the trenching, right, and the operators for all that kind of stuff. It's the fact that the pipe is 8 inches or 10 inches in diameter, I mean, that's a difference. It's a tangible difference, but it's not the difference between a crew being out there or not being out there. So there's a little bit of a difference in cost. But the reason we showed them together is because we saw them as linked, but technically, yeah, either neighborhood could go by itself. Ron,
and there's also a question about how to define the disability deferment.
Ron might be muted.
Thanks, Ed. Sorry about that. So those definitions, what's referred to in the code refers to federal guidelines in terms of those definitions, and we can certainly direct you to those provisions that talk about under which acts and which policies the disability is determined.
Okay, so I'm going to spend a few minutes just talking about what are some of the more public benefits. Ed mentioned there is state funding is available for septic connections, and the new program features that we're talking about today, the subsidy and the partial deferment, are also for the septic system. So why is there an interest from these public agencies in supporting the septic system conversion? So that's what we really want to talk about a little bit. The main reason is that traditional septic systems are not very effective at removing nitrogen. And our current wastewater treatment plants have all been upgraded and have an excellent nitrogen removal performance. And so as we work within the broader context of the Chesapeake Bay, it's called a total maximum daily load. So it's basically a pollution, they call it a pollution diet for the Chesapeake Bay. And that has limitations on nitrogen and phosphorus, okay? And so there is a benefit overall if septic systems are connected to the public sewer system. That nitrogen that normally goes out of your septic tank, makes its way through the drain field and eventually into the waterway, that nitrogen will get removed at our wastewater treatment plants. And so that's why the state supports funding those connections, and that's also why the county is providing support for that. On the county level, it helps us maintain compliance. The county has target levels for nitrogen loads for Anne Arundel County, which we are meeting right now. But we're meeting them not because of reduced loads through septic systems. We're meeting them from our efforts through stormwater management and our improvements to our wastewater treatment plants. So that's kind of the state is a little bit more interested in the Chesapeake Bay aspect of it, but the county also has an interest closer to our local waterways. The county has 5 major rivers, almost 500 miles of shoreline. I think actually a little bit more than 500 miles of shoreline. And nearly all the county's waterways are listed as impaired for nutrients and other improvements. So this program is really designed to, because of this public benefit aspect of septic connections, that's why there's funding from the state and local level on that. Can we go to the next slide? So Anne Arundel County has a very large number of septic systems, 40,000 septic systems. 13,000 systems are in what's called the critical area. That's an area that's within 1,000 feet of a tidal waterway. That 13,000 septic system amount is actually a quarter of all the critical area septic systems in the state. It is a significant portion of the county's nitrogen load, and those systems do impact the local waterways. And one other thing on this map that we're showing is the subsidies and the partial deferment that Ron was talking about are not actually available to all septic systems in the county. They're really available to these blue areas on this map called eligible areas. And as you can see, these eligible areas are those that are really close to the waterways. These are defined in the code, an eligible area, as being in the critical area, in being in what's called a health department on-site wastewater problem area, or in an area that we think is relatively close to the existing public sewer. So you can go to the next slide. And this septic to sewer program is integrated with an overall strategy that the county has developed to maintain its nitrogen loads for the Chesapeake Bay. So there's the septic to sewer connection program, which is what we're talking about tonight. There's another program aspect, which is small system upgrades, where we're looking at taking over and improving small private wastewater systems. There is our ongoing stormwater projects that are managed out of the Bureau of Watershed Protection and Restoration. There's a groundwater resiliency component of the program. And then there's our wastewater treatment enhancements. I'd mentioned the county has upgraded its wastewater treatment plants using Bay restoration funding. And our nitrogen loads are actually about 50% of what they were 10 years ago. So we've made a lot of improvements in some sectors, but septic systems is not a sector where we've seen a lot of improvement or reduction in nitrogen loads.
George, before I go on here, there is a question with regard to infrastructure. The resident would like to know how large the lifter pump station would be to run sewage uphill from 79 Glen Oban houses to the B&A Boulevard, and where would it be located?
George, I can take part of the question as far as the location.
Yeah, okay. I was just going to ask you to do that, Ed. Thank you.
Yeah, and I'm just cheating because I'm looking at a map of the conceptual layout that was prepared. So just a very preliminary planning exercise that DPW performed. There'd be 2 pump stations, so 1 in each community. The one in Glen Oban is kind of in the southeast corner of the neighborhood. So if you can imagine, these pump stations are generally located in lower lying areas, so it can collect as much flow by gravity as possible. Then it pumps back up. So located off of Kinloch Circle, can't say specifically, which property, but just in that vicinity. And then in Severn View, preliminary location is on the northwest side of the neighborhood, off of Southview, kind of down near the creek, looks like Asquith Creek. And then it pumps from there up towards Baltimore-Annapolis Boulevard. And the size of the pump stations, maybe, George, that's something that you could comment on in terms of space that it takes up and what a typical.
So they're not large structures. There is a component that would be most of it is below ground. Okay, so there would be a what's called a wet well, which is a large tank that would be below ground, but it would have an access hatch on the top. There is another vault that would also have an access hatch at the top where we would have valves that are used to operate or possibly bypass the station. There's usually a generator. There will be a generator on site, and then there was a small building. So the footprint is not large, and this is an example of kind of our older style building. It's about 18 feet by 22 feet, but this actually has the generator inside. And in some locations, we put the generator outside. It helps us reduce the cost of the building. But we need to then, take the aesthetics into consideration. So I don't have a rough footprint that I can provide right now, but we are looking at that in terms of, we understand it needs to be as small as possible. And then we also need to look at the truck access in and out of the location. So I'm going to talk a little bit now about the application, and actually we're just going to talk about the application process and not so much the petition process, because that's really the next step. So do you want to go to the next slide? So this is the whole process from application through petition. And I know there was a question earlier about how long it takes. And so we do have on the slide, somewhere between 2.5 to 3 years for a typical project. So there's several main steps which we've summarized here. The first one is just what we're doing tonight, which is a general information meeting where we're just trying to share how the area might be served and what the costs might be. If there is some additional interest, we would encourage the community to submit an application. And what the application really does is it defines a project area and it allows us to rank a community. And we have a system for ranking potential projects. Our goal in this whole program is to try to connect 6,000 septic systems over the next 30 years. So we're trying to target 200 homes a year. And that's really done to balance the subsidy out. So we've developed a ranking system for potential projects so we can determine which areas we should offer the subsidy for. So the application is really a tool for us to see that a community is interested, and also it's kind of to compare communities based on some certain criteria. So once the community has submitted an application, if it looks like they're a real candidate for a subsidy, we would do a conceptual engineering study. And that's a very high level engineering study that would firm up some of the things related to where the pump stations might be located, which houses might be gravity sewers. Sometimes there's houses that can't be served by gravity and they need what's called a grinder system. So we try to identify those, and we would update the cost information. And we would have another community meeting, just like tonight's, where we would present that updated information. This also gives us a chance to look at whether the neighborhood has changed since we did some of these preliminary layouts. Some of the layout information that we're talking about was originally generated by us many years ago when we were looking at possible options for connecting septic systems in different locations. So we also need to kind of check to see we have the most up-to-date information. After that, step two, which is the second community meeting, the next step is really for the community to submit a formal petition to DPW. And in submitting a petition, how that works is we would work with the community coordinator to define what the petition area is going to be. And then DPW will actually mail out the petition forms with the map to everybody in the defined project area. And that's really the kind of the start of the formal process, is when we send out the petition forms. And the petition form would basically be asking you to indicate whether you're interested in petitioning for sewer service or not. If the majority of the residents indicate they're in favor, we would open a contract and start a preliminary engineering study. And the code uses the term majority. So by that, we're looking at 50% of the area plus one vote. So, but at that point, we go to that step 3. So during step 4 is, so the petition has come in, it comes really to my group in utility design, and we'll do a preliminary engineering study. We will further develop the layout and the costs, and we will create that updated construction cost estimate that Ron was talking about earlier, the construction cost, the project cost. And then Ron's group will work on developing an estimated assessment. And we will hold a formal public hearing. That's really goes on in step 4. We'll hold a formal public hearing. We'll go over the proposed project, what the construction would look like, what the costs are, and what the ballot would be. What the ballot would be, and you would get mailed a ballot that basically says, I agree to pay X number of dollars, per year for the extension of sewer service to my area, yes or no. And at that point, that ballot vote becomes part of the binding process. So in step 4 on this diagram, if the majority votes to go forward with the project, then everybody in the project area has to connect. And that's an important part of the process to understand, so that the 51% can make the 49% connect. If the votes if the majority are not in favor of the project, then that is the end of the petition, and there's no additional work on it. We just closed it out. If the majority is in favor of the petition, then DPW would go ahead with the final design. We would advertise the project, construct the system, and then once the system is complete, a notice would be sent out to everyone in the project area saying the system is ready to be connected to, and you have basically at that point you would have 9 months to connect. So that's really the whole process from beginning to end. The actual assessments are based on the final costs of the project. So if the project costs come in a little bit lower than whatever was on the ballot, then what would be in that assessment would be the actual final cost. If the bids on the project come in significantly higher than we expected, and the numbers are going to be higher than what's on the ballot, we would have the community would have an opportunity to revisit that vote. So I know that was a lot about the process, so we're going to pause for questions maybe in a few minutes. I got just a couple more slides to go through. So let's talk a little bit about the application. So as I mentioned, that the application is a non-binding step. It's really just a way for us to recognize a community is interested and kind of rank different communities. For an application, we really just need a community name, a contact person, sort of a community coordinator. We need a project area map, and we can help prepare that if we have an idea of what the project area is, where there seems to be some interest. And then we look for some initial show of community support. If it's a formal HOA or a civic association, we can take a letter. In some instances, we do an online poll during these meetings. I think because we have a relatively small group tonight, I'm not sure we should do the poll. You could also do, if there's some consensus at an outreach meeting, which, probably, again, we don't quite have the crowd for that today. But another way to let us know is if you go to the next slide, Rakia. So we have set up a community webpage. This is on the ourwater.org website, which is the county's website about the integrated nutrient plan, the Our Water plan. We've actually set up a page for this community or this combined communities. And if you go to the Our Water page, you go to the septic to sewer page and you enter your address, you should get a message that says you're in an eligible area and, kind of link to your community page. So on that page, we'll have, eventually, we'll have the slides from tonight's meeting. We'll have the recording from tonight's meeting. And we will have a meeting summary when we have a chance to review and kind of summarize any questions and answers. Rakia, do you think you can put a link? There you go. So she just put in a link that will take you straight to the page. Oh, it's on the slide too. I didn't see that. Sorry. You can also leave on that page, you can tell us whether you're interested or not, or leave comments. So we do a number of these presentations. We're always welcome for some feedback on how things were presented or whether they were confusing or too fast or too slow. But you can also say, yes, I'm interested, and no, I'm not interested. And we'll be able to see those responses. So this is also a good way if you have some neighbors or some other people in your community that couldn't attend the meeting tonight. You can have them come to the web page and take a look at the slides and some of the information there and let us know. So can you go to the next slide? So just to kind of repeat, I guess, and summarize, the next step for this community would be to submit an application. I know we had a question earlier about, I think we had a question about how much interest has to be for an application. We don't, because it's not binding and we're really just trying to define an area to see if there might be some interest. We're really just looking for maybe 20% of the area. Now for here, that would be, what's that? Maybe 30 people interested. And then we would do the conceptual engineering and refine the costs and come back and do another presentation. And our real goal there is to have some sort of threshold so we don't have just one or two people out of, say, 150 that are interested, and because that's not really reflective of the community being interested. So, and just to reiterate, we use the application just to kind of compare communities and rank them and decide where we ought to direct the subsidy each year. And it's not a financial commitment. And so when with the application, you're not voting yes or no on anything. You're just saying, yeah, I'm interested in learning, a little bit more about the process and getting the cost refined a little bit. So that is our last slide for this evening. Okay, so
George, there are a few questions back up in the chat.
Okay.
The first one is the project cost when presented for community vote, the estimated cost of the project, or the actual assessment for your property?
Yeah. So at the time of the ballot, it is the estimated cost of the assessment, because what we're preparing. Actually, can you go back? I think it's slide 30, Rakia. So we're going to do this preliminary engineering study. And at that point, it's also called the schematic design report. It's the project, the design is only 30% complete. So it's got more detail on it. We've sifted out what alignment we're recommending. We'll be able to show some detail about what the pumping station would look like, where we think it would be. But we haven't finalized so we haven't hired the designer to do the final design, and we haven't hired the contractor and the inspection team. So what we'll be doing at that point is, putting together our best project cost estimate based on the construction cost estimate that we'll have at that point. The final assessment at the very end is based on the actual project cost. So after we've gone through, the project's been bid and constructed, we've hired everybody's come and gone that's going to work on the project. When all of that is done, that's when we do the final project assessment.
Okay, the next resident has multiple questions. The first one is, who pays for removal and dwelling restoration from houses on low sides after heavy rain, load back charges sewage into house basements?
Who pays for removal and dwelling restoration from houses on low sides after heavy rains? So I think the question is, if you're on the public system and then there's a backup into your house from the public system, when the power goes out, if it would, it was backed up. So if there was a backup in the home that was a result of the county sewer backing up, I believe that would be something that the county would be responsible for. But I don't directly get involved in that. But if I think that's how it would work. Can we have a map of where the 8 to 10 inch pipes would go on in Glen Owen? So I don't think we have a force main layout, Ed, unless you have another layer on there that, but until we really completed that schematic design and determined where we would be siting that pumping station, we wouldn't really have that piping alignment available to show. So I don't know that we would necessarily even have that at the concept engineer when we do the next meeting with the concept memo, unless we were really pretty firm on which was going to be the best route from one place to the other. Is there a way,
George,
okay,
if I could chime in on that second part of that question, when power goes out, that's why there's an emergency generator in the design of the sewage pumping station that would keep that facility going.
Our facility would, our pumping station would have an emergency generator. That's right. Yes. And there's actually connections that are put out there also for bypass connection if in an emergency there was, say, something wrong with the pumps themselves. So there are a lot of measures we take to try to minimize the chance of any possible spills. I think there is there any way, can we know the amount of a subsidy before the final project commences? So yes, when we present the ballot, that will have the subsidies incorporated into it. So that information would be at the time when we've actually done the schematic design, and we would also go through these different payment options, but at that time we would have the subsidy set up. So I think there's a question about the $80,000 didn't match a different number that was presented earlier. Did we have a different number than 80,000? So the $80,000 is the cost of that assessment. So it's a $2,000 a year for the 40 years, right? There was a range that was presented earlier, and that was that range of $1,500 to $2,600 was trying to take into account some of the variability between if you don't do a partial deferment versus if you take a 50% deferment. There's also getting further into the details. The amount of the subsidy on both the state and the county level is impacted by your income. So there's different a range, and that's something we would go into in more detail if there was interest. We actually used to have that in detail in the slides, and we thought it was a little too much at this point. So, but that's why those numbers don't quite line up. There's a question about. Okay, so yeah, this water is on public. So it's a question about county water, comparing it to county water. So one of the changes to the code that was made a few years ago is that we no longer use a front foot assessment for a sewer petition or a water petition. This community does have water, and that's probably where the front foot assessment was coming from before. So now it would be done differently. Now it's done by the number of homes, the number of properties in the area.
And there's also a question, George, about if the homeowner would need to have a backflow interrupter on the sewer line.
I mean, I think those are typically recommended, but the county service would end at a clean out that would be close to the property line. And then beyond the clean out back to the homeowner's property is part of what on the earlier slides we were talking about on the private side costs. So I don't know that we would go as a firm as saying, yes, you have to do it. That would be something we would say you should consult your plumber about that.
Hello?
Yes.
Hi, this is Larry Grimm. My daughter has property. She had a property that had a sewer backup into her basement. Her insurance didn't cover it, and the county didn't cover it. Not this county, but another county. And she was told that her responsibility was to put a backflow interrupter or backflow preventer on the sewer line. It's about it cost her about $140. The barn door was closed after the horses ran away. But it's not an expensive thing to do, and it does address the question about sewage flowing back into your house, because that's what the purpose of it is on a municipal sewer system, to keep it from backflowing in and sending waste into your basement. So I was addressing a question a fellow resident here had with it, that it's doable. Does that help?
Yeah, that makes sense to me. So, I mean, I think probably that would still ultimately be the homeowner's decision, but it seems like a prudent addition. When you're getting, you would need to get your the plumbing around your house revised, right? Because right now it's going into a septic system, so it need to be rerouted. So for the it's probably not a large cost compared, in the overall amount. So there was a question about will the lines go to the front of the houses or the back of the houses? So what the way actually, Rakia, can you go to slide? Let's do slide 12. Can you go to slide 12? So the public side of the system would be the main in the street out to what's called a clean out. So the clean out is going to be it's just a stack really that comes out of a gravity line that is going to be just on the private side of the line between the county's right of way and the private property. And so the public side costs, and that's the part that's covered by the assessment, would be to build that line in the street and include the clean out. Okay, anything past the clean out to the back to the house, including the septic tank, is all what we're calling the private side costs in this discussion. And so you would need to get the line out to the clean out, basically. And we have some flexibility on, where like along your lot, the clean out can be located, but we would not be putting the clean out, say, back into further into somebody's private property. So our crews are only going to be kind of accessing, if there's a call out, they might come and check the clean out just to see if the county's line is causing a problem. But that's going to be done from right there at the street side. And you would need to work with a master plumber to take a look really at how your site, where is going to be the best location. So like when we're building the project, our inspector or the project manager will be trying to communicate with everybody about where they would like to have the clean out placed. But that decision really is between between your plumber and your master plumber and your home and the homeowner. So there's a question, Ed, maybe you could answer this one, is what percentage of the Glen open houses would have a owner side lifter pump? So did we have an area that we were calling probably have to have grinder pumps in Glen Open?
Yeah, the preliminary layout showed some grinder pumps. I think this question is more about, if I'm interpreting it correctly, owner side pumps. So we think of a more difficult situation where there's topography that slopes down significantly in the backyard, and the homeowner would have to have a second grinder pump effectively installed to pump it up to the street, whether it's to the trunk sewer or to a low pressure system that would be served by another grinder located at the right of way. So it's really not possible to answer that question right now at this preliminary stage in terms of a percentage. There's different ways to do it. Part of the engineering study, after an application is submitted and accepted, would be to look at alternatives for laying out the sewer. And that's where we'd get into whether it makes more sense to do a grinder based system versus a gravity. And I think at that time it'd be more possible to comment.
So there was a question, the private side costs are in addition to the 80,000. So that is yes. So the private side costs are separate from what's covered by the assessment. The assessment's for the public side cost. But in a lot of cases, the private side costs can be covered by the Bay Restoration Fund grants. But it is a separate cost. I see there's a question about would the B&A trail and the BG&E right-of-way affect things? We would need to probably cross. I don't think we're going along anybody's area. So yes, it would affect it, but we would figure a way around it or through it with the appropriate permissions. So let's see. Are we caught up on all the questions, Rakia?
Yes. Does anyone have any other? Oh, if the septic needs to be abandoned, are we supposed to fill them on our costs?
So yes, part of the private side costs is abandoning the current septic system. As the question indicates, a typical approach is that they are abandoned in place and filled in. But the health department does, here we go. Yeah, the health department does have some guidelines for that. It requires a licensed disposal system contractor, and the contents of the tank need to be hauled out. But that is part of the private side costs. Okay. Well, that's all we had for our formal presentation tonight. We can have our team stand by for a few more minutes if anybody else has any questions, but we really appreciate you spending your time with us this evening. And I hope this was informative for you, and that gives you something to talk to your neighbors about.